Parents make sons sleep in backyard for weeks. When neighbors realize why, they call 911. Hello. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and comment on what you think is going to happen. Let's see if you can guess correctly. Write your prediction below, and at the end, I'll give you the answer. It was the middle of summer, the air thick with the scent of freshly cut grass, and the days were long and blistering. From the outside, the Wilson family seemed like any other in their quiet suburban neighborhood. Their home was neatly kept, and their lawn always perfectly manicured. But there was one thing that set them apart. Their son Josh was nowhere to be seen inside the house. Neighbors occasionally glimpsed him outside, sitting on a worn sleeping bag under a makeshift tarp in the backyard. His nights were spent there, exposed to the elements, no matter how hot or stormy it got. To those looking in, it seemed like nothing more than a peculiar choice for a boy his age. But behind closed doors, the truth was far darker. Josh's parents, Mark and Sarah Wilson, had always been strict. But recently, their discipline had taken a more punishing turn. For reasons unknown to the neighbors, Josh had been exiled from his bedroom, forced to sleep outside every night for weeks. His once carefree laughter had faded, replaced with a silence that spoke volumes. The neighbors noticed, but no one dared to ask the Wilsons directly what was going on. After all, Mark was an intimidating figure, a man of few words and harsh stares. Sarah, too, kept her distance, only engaging in polite, brief exchanges with the other women on the street. As the weeks dragged on, concern among the neighbors grew, but they kept their suspicions to themselves. Josh wasn't the same boy anymore. His shoulders slumped, his eyes hollow. The few times anyone saw him, it was clear that something was terribly wrong. His clothes, once bright and playful, were now dirty and tattered, his skin pale from lack of sleep and constant exposure to the elements. He barely spoke, and when he did, it was in whispered tones, as if he feared being overheard. The only sound that ever came from the Wilson house was the sharp bark of orders from Mark, or the occasional low hum of the television late at night. Whatever was happening, Josh bore the brunt of it in silence. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the yard, Mrs. Adams from next door stood on her porch, watching. She had seen enough. Her heart ached for the boy who, not long ago, had been full of life and energy. Something had to be done. She knew the other neighbors were equally disturbed by what they were seeing, but no one wanted to be the one to interfere. "It's not our place," they whispered. But Mrs. Adams disagreed. She couldn't shake the feeling that something much more sinister was at play, and that feeling gnawed at her every day. Finally, she made up her mind. Tomorrow, she would make the call. The following morning, Mrs. Adams sat by her window, clutching the phone in her hand. She watched as Josh's small figure moved about the backyard, sluggishly folding the tarp that had become his makeshift shelter. The clouds above promised rain, but no one seemed concerned about bringing him inside. Mrs. Adams' heart pounded as her finger hovered over the dial. "What if I'm overreacting?" she whispered to herself. Yet, the memory of Josh's pale face and downcast eyes urged her on. She had heard the whispers from the other neighbors, the hushed conversations about why a boy his age would be left outside like that for so long. Something wasn't right, and she knew she couldn't turn a blind eye any longer. Her hands trembled as she dialed 911. When the operator answered, she hesitated for just a second, her mind racing with doubt. But then she spoke, her voice firm and resolute. "I need to report something about my neighbors," she began. She described the situation as best she could. The weeks of seeing Josh sleep outside, his disheveled appearance, the eerie silence from the Wilson household. The operator listened carefully and reassured Mrs. Adams that someone would be sent to investigate. As she hung up the phone, a mixture of relief and fear washed over her. There was no turning back now. That afternoon, 2 police officers arrived, their car silently rolling to a stop in front of the Wilson home. Mrs. Adams watched from behind her curtains, her heart racing as they approached the door. Mark Wilson answered, his tall frame blocking the entrance. Even from a distance, Mrs. Adams could see the tension in his posture, the rigid set of his jaw as he spoke to the officers. Whatever he said, it was brief. The officers exchanged glances before asking to look around. Reluctantly, Mark stepped aside, allowing them to enter the house. Moments later, Sarah appeared, her face pale and drawn. She stood silently beside her husband as the officers made their way through the home. Josh, sitting quietly on the back porch, watched as the officers approached him. They asked him a few questions, simple things at first. How long he had been outside, why he wasn't in the house. Josh looked down at his feet, mumbling something incoherent. One of the officers knelt beside him, speaking in a softer tone. "It's okay, kid. You can tell us what's going on." But Josh remained silent, his hands fidgeting nervously in his lap. Behind him, Mark stood at the back door, his cold eyes fixed on the scene unfolding in front of him. Sarah lingered inside, peeking out from behind the curtains. After what seemed like an eternity, the officers returned to their car. They hadn't found anything concrete, no visible signs of abuse, no immediate danger. Josh's silence had made it hard for them to understand the gravity of the situation. But as they drove away, Mrs. Adams couldn't shake the feeling that something had been left unsaid, that Josh's silence was his way of crying out for help. She knew the visit wouldn't be the end of it. In her heart, she believed that the truth would eventually come to light. The days that followed the police visit seemed quieter than usual. The Wilson household was eerily still, and Josh remained outside, though his tarp had been replaced by a small tent, likely a gesture to avoid further attention. Mrs. Adams could tell that the officer's visit had rattled the family. She caught fleeting glimpses of Mark, pacing in the backyard, his face clouded with frustration. Sarah, who usually tended to the garden, now barely stepped outside. It was as if the thin veil of normalcy the Wilsons had worn had been torn away, exposing something darker beneath the surface. Despite the tent, Josh's situation hadn't improved. The neighbors had stopped whispering, but their eyes still lingered on the boy whenever he shuffled through the yard, too quiet for a child his age. He no longer played with the other kids from the block, his interactions reduced to nods and quick glances. Mrs. Adams' heart ached every time she saw him, but her earlier call to the authorities had yielded little more than a temporary disturbance. Now, more than ever, she felt helpless. One afternoon, while sitting on her porch, she noticed something odd. Josh wasn't alone in the backyard. A young boy, no older than Josh, had wandered over to the fence. The two of them exchanged a few words before the boy passed something small through the fence, a piece of bread, perhaps, or a snack. Josh accepted it with a weak smile and stuffed it into his pocket. Mrs. Adams leaned forward, her brow furrowing. She had never seen any of the neighborhood children interact with Josh like that before. Could this boy be the key to uncovering the truth? Later that evening, under the cover of dusk, Mrs. Adams saw the same boy return. This time, he carried something larger, wrapped in a cloth. The two boys exchanged hurried whispers before Josh took the package and hid it beneath his tent. Mrs. Adams' stomach twisted. She knew she should step in, but something stopped her. What was Josh hiding? And why hadn't he shared it with the police when they had visited? The encounter left her restless, questions swirling in her mind as she tried to sleep. The next morning, the weather had turned gloomy, with thick clouds hanging low in the sky. Mrs. Adams' curiosity got the better of her. She walked across her lawn, pretending to inspect her garden, edging closer to the fence that divided her yard from the Wilsons'. As she peered through a small gap in the wooden slats, she saw Josh sitting by his tent, his hands holding the cloth-wrapped package. He was unwrapping it carefully, revealing what looked like an old, tattered notebook. His face was drawn in concentration as he flipped through its pages, his lips moving slightly as if reading aloud. Mrs. Adams couldn't make out the words, but something about the boy's intense focus unsettled her. What was in that notebook? And why had he hidden it so carefully? Her thoughts raced as she quickly retreated back to her porch, her mind buzzing with possibilities. Whatever Josh was holding on to, it wasn't just the remnants of childhood innocence. It was something deeper, something that might explain the strange behavior of his parents and the growing tension that seemed to grip the Wilson household. Days turned into weeks, and the situation in the Wilson household grew even more peculiar. Josh continued his routine, but something about him had changed. The notebook that Mrs. Adams had glimpsed him with became a permanent fixture in his hands. He carried it with him wherever he went, clutching it as though it held the key to his survival. The boy from the neighboring house still visited occasionally, slipping Josh food or supplies. But the exchanges had grown more secretive, their conversations hushed and hurried. One evening, Mrs. Adams could no longer contain her curiosity. She decided to approach the young boy during one of his visits to Josh. As dusk fell, she caught him just as he was leaving the Wilson backyard, a small bundle tucked under his arm. "Hey there, son," she called softly, not wanting to startle him. The boy froze, his wide eyes betraying a mixture of fear and guilt. "Don't worry," Mrs. Adams continued gently. "I've seen you bringing things to Josh. I'm not here to get you in trouble. I just want to understand what's going on." The boy hesitated for a moment before reluctantly stepping closer. His name was Tim, he explained, and he had been friends with Josh for as long as he could remember. But over the past few months, everything had changed. Josh had stopped coming to school, and his parents had grown increasingly strict, isolating him from the outside world. Tim didn't know why Josh had been forced to sleep outside, but he had overheard something disturbing one evening when he visited his friend. "Josh's dad, he keeps talking about something bad that happened," Tim whispered, his voice trembling. "Something about a secret they're all keeping. I think it's why they're making Josh stay out here. He's paying for it." Mrs. Adams' heart sank. What kind of secret could be so terrible that a boy would be punished like this? She thanked Tim for his honesty, urging him to stay safe and to keep his distance for now. But deep down, she knew she couldn't let this go. Whatever Mark and Sarah Wilson were hiding, it was starting to unravel, and the more she thought about it, the more certain she became that the notebook Josh held so tightly was the key to everything. That night, as the wind howled through the neighborhood and rain began to splatter against her window, Mrs. Adams sat in her living room, her mind racing. She couldn't ignore what Tim had told her. The Wilsons weren't just strict. They were harboring something dark, something that had drawn their own son into a web of secrecy and punishment. But what could it be? And how could a young boy like Josh be at the center of it all? The rain grew heavier, turning into a storm that rattled the trees and sent thunder rumbling through the sky. Mrs. Adams peered out of her window, her gaze fixed on the Wilson backyard. Josh's tent was barely holding up against the downpour, and for the first time, she saw movement inside the Wilson home. Mark and Sarah stood by the back door, watching the storm. But even as the winds whipped through the yard, they didn't call Josh inside. He remained in the backyard, alone in the rain, clutching his notebook as if it were the only thing keeping him grounded. The next morning, the storm had passed, but the air was thick with the aftermath. Mrs. Adams knew what she had to do. She couldn't sit by any longer, watching this boy suffer in silence. She needed answers, and the only way to get them was to confront the source, Josh himself. As the sun broke through the clouds, she made her way across the yard, her heart pounding in her chest. This time, she wouldn't turn back. Mrs. Adams approached the fence cautiously, her eyes fixed on Josh. He was sitting under the remnants of his tent, damp from the night's storm. His small frame looked even smaller in the harsh morning light, and the notebook was still clutched tightly in his hands. As she reached the edge of the yard, she called out softly, "Josh!" The boy flinched at the sound of her voice, his wide eyes snapping up to meet hers. For a moment, they just stared at each other, the weight of everything unsaid hanging between them. "I'm not here to get you in trouble," Mrs. Adams continued gently. "I just want to help. I've seen you out here for weeks, and I know something isn't right." Josh looked down at the notebook in his lap, his fingers tracing its worn edges. For a long time, he didn't say anything. Mrs. Adams waited, her heart pounding in her chest. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Josh spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's all my fault." Mrs. Adams furrowed her brow. "What do you mean, Josh? How could any of this be your fault?" Josh swallowed hard, his hands tightening around the notebook. "It's because of what happened," he said, his voice shaking. "Something bad. Something I shouldn't have known about. My dad, he found out that I knew, and now I have to pay for it." Mrs. Adams knelt down by the fence, her voice soft and reassuring. "Josh, whatever it is, you don't have to carry it alone. You can tell me. I'll help you." But Josh shook his head, his eyes filling with tears. "I can't," he whispered. "If I tell, they'll make things worse. My dad, he won't let me go back inside." Mrs. Adams' heart broke at the sight of the boy struggling with such a heavy burden. She knew she had to tread carefully. "Is it something to do with that notebook?" she asked gently. Josh hesitated, then nodded slowly. "It's all in here," he said. "Everything I found out. Everything they've been hiding." He glanced toward the house, fear flashing in his eyes. "If my dad knew I was talking to you, he'd get so mad." Mrs. Adams took a deep breath, her mind racing. Whatever was in that notebook, it was the key to understanding why Josh had been punished, why his parents had become so distant and secretive. She had to get him to open up, but without pushing too hard. "Josh," she said softly, "you don't have to tell me everything right now, but I promise you, whatever it is, you're not alone. We can figure this out together." Josh wiped at his eyes, sniffling. I don't know what to do anymore," he admitted. "I'm so scared." Mrs. Adams reached through the fence, gently placing a hand on his shoulder. "You've been so brave, Josh," she said. "But you don't have to keep this secret any longer. We can go to the police together. We can show them the notebook. They'll understand." Josh glanced down at the notebook again, uncertainty flickering in his eyes. For a moment, Mrs. Adams thought he might agree. But then, just as quickly, the fear returned. He shook his head, clutching the notebook tighter. "I can't," he whispered. "If I tell, they'll make me stay out here forever." Mrs. Adams felt a surge of helplessness. The fear that Josh had been living with was palpable, and it wasn't going to be easy to convince him to trust anyone after what he'd been through. But she knew one thing for certain. Whatever was happening in that house, it had to stop. "Okay, Josh," she said quietly. "I won't push you, but if you ever change your mind, if you ever feel ready to talk, I'll be here. You don't have to face this alone." As Mrs. Adams turned to leave, she couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. Whatever secret the Wilsons were hiding, it was eating away at Josh, and sooner or later, it would come crashing down. She only hoped it wouldn't be too late. The days after Mrs. Adams' conversation with Josh passed in a tense quiet. She hadn't seen him for a couple of days, and her worry grew. Every morning, she peeked through her curtains, hoping to catch a glimpse of him, but the backyard was empty. The once bustling Wilson household had fallen into an eerie stillness, and something told her that whatever was happening inside that house was reaching a boiling point. Then, one afternoon, as Mrs. Adams was watering her garden, she saw him. Josh was standing near the fence, staring at her. His face was pale, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and desperation. Clutched tightly in his hands was the notebook, the same one that seemed to hold all the secrets he had been too afraid to reveal. She quickly walked over to him, her heart racing as she knelt by the fence. "Josh, are you okay?" she asked, her voice soft but urgent. Josh didn't answer right away. His hands shook as he fumbled with the notebook, flipping through its pages with shaky fingers. Finally, he found the page he had been searching for and handed the notebook through the fence. Mrs. Adams hesitated, her eyes searching his for some sign of reassurance, but all she saw was fear. She took the notebook from him, her hands trembling as she opened it. The pages were filled with scrawled handwriting, messy and frantic, as if written in a rush. It was a mixture of notes, drawings, and what looked like letters. The more Mrs. Adams read, the more her heart sank. The notebook detailed things no child should ever have to know. Conversations between his parents about money they owed, shady dealings with dangerous people, and most chillingly, a mention of something terrible that had happened in the house. Mrs. Adams' breath caught in her throat as she read the last entry. "Dad said it's my fault. He said if I hadn't been in the wrong place at the wrong time, none of this would have happened. But I didn't mean to see it. I didn't mean to hear them talking about it. Now I'm paying for it. They say I have to stay outside so no one can hear me." Tears welled in Mrs. Adams' eyes as the pieces of the puzzle fell into place. Josh had been a witness to something his parents were desperate to hide. And instead of protecting him, they had punished him, forcing him to carry the burden of their secret in silence. She looked up at Josh, her voice barely a whisper. "Josh, what did you see?" Josh's eyes filled with tears as he shook his head. "I can't say it," he whispered, his voice trembling. "If I do, they'll come for me." His fear was palpable, and Mrs. Adams knew that whatever he had witnessed was more than just a family dispute. It was something dangerous, something that had made his parents willing to risk their own son's well-being to keep hidden. Mrs. Adams knew she had no choice. She had to go to the authorities again, this time armed with the notebook and the full weight of what Josh had been forced to endure. But before she could say anything more, the back door of the Wilson house swung open. Mark Wilson stepped outside, his eyes narrowing
Ajută-mă
as he
să-mi
spotted
realizez
Josh by the
visul de a
fence.
atinge 100.000
Get
de
inside
abonați.
now, he
Abonează-te
barked,
la
his voice low
canal,
and menacing.
relaxează-te,
Josh
respiră
flinched,
adânc și
quickly
hai să
pulling away
începem
from the
această
fence and
frumoasă
retreating
poveste.
toward the house. Mrs. Adams watched helplessly as Josh disappeared inside, the notebook still clutched in her hands. Mark glanced in her direction, his expression cold and calculating, as if daring her to act. She stood frozen, the weight of the notebook heavy in her arms. Whatever power Mark Wilson held over his family, it was clear he wasn't afraid to use it. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the yard, Mrs. Adams knew what she had to do. She couldn't let Josh suffer in silence any longer. That night she would make the call, this time with the truth laid bare. And she would make sure that Josh's voice was finally heard. That evening, Mrs. Adams sat at her kitchen table, the notebook spread open before her. Every word Josh had written weighed heavily on her heart. She couldn't shake the image of his frightened face, the way he had clutched the notebook like it was his only lifeline. She knew she had to act, but the fear of what might happen to Josh if Mark Wilson found out gnawed at her. Still, the truth could no longer stay hidden. With trembling hands, she picked up the phone and dialed 911. As the ringing filled her ears, her mind raced through the details she would share with the dispatcher. This time, it wasn't just a concerned neighbor's suspicions, she had proof. The moment the operator picked up, Mrs. Adams spoke quickly, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her. "I need to report child abuse," she said. "It's about my neighbors, the Wilson family. I have evidence." The operator listened carefully as Mrs. Adams explained everything. The weeks Josh had spent outside, the strange behavior of his parents, and finally the notebook. The operator's tone shifted when Mrs. Adams mentioned the contents of the notebook and Josh's chilling description of what he had seen. "Please stay on the line, ma'am," the operator said. "We're sending officers to the address immediately." Mrs. Adams hung up, her heart pounding in her chest. She paced the room, glancing anxiously toward the Wilsons' house, where the lights were dim and the windows were dark. Time seemed to stretch as she waited, each second heavy with anticipation. Finally, the sound of approaching sirens broke the silence. She rushed to the window, watching as 2 police cars pulled up in front of the Wilson home. Officers stepped out, their flashlights cutting through the night as they approached the front door. Mrs. Adams' breath hitched as she saw Mark Wilson answer, his expression hard and unreadable. The conversation between him and the officers was brief, and then the officers stepped inside. For a long moment, nothing happened. The house remained dark and still, and Mrs. Adams feared the worst. Had Mark managed to convince them, once again, that everything was fine? But then the door opened and 2 officers emerged, guiding Josh out of the house. He looked small and fragile in the harsh glow of their flashlights, but there was a glimmer of relief in his eyes as he stepped into the fresh air. Mrs. Adams exhaled, her heart swelling with a mix of relief and sorrow. Josh was safe, but the road ahead would be long. As the officers placed Josh in the back of one of the patrol cars, another officer approached Mrs. Adams' house. She met him at the door, clutching the notebook to her chest. "You did the right thing," the officer said softly, his eyes kind but serious. "This will help us understand what's been happening." Mrs. Adams handed him the notebook, her hands shaking slightly as she let it go. "Please," she whispered, "take care of him." The officer nodded, his expression solemn. "We will," he promised, "and we'll get to the bottom of this." As the patrol cars pulled away, taking Josh to safety, Mrs. Adams stood on her porch, watching the scene unfold with a mixture of relief and dread. She had done what she could, but the secrets of the Wilson family still loomed large. Mark and Sarah had been questioned, but they weren't in handcuffs. Not yet. Mrs. Adams knew that this was only the beginning. The truth was finally coming to light, but it would take time for the full extent of what Josh had witnessed to be revealed. That night, as she lay in bed, the weight of everything that had happened pressed down on her. She had saved Josh from further harm, but the darkness surrounding the Wilsons had yet to fully emerge. Whatever Josh had seen, whatever terrible event had led to his exile, was still out there, waiting to be uncovered. And in the quiet of her darkened bedroom, Mrs. Adams made a promise to herself. She would be there for Josh, no matter what. He had been silenced for too long, and now, with the help of those who believed in him, he would finally have his chance to speak. The morning after the police took Josh away, the neighborhood was unusually quiet. Word of the late-night intervention had spread quickly, but no one dared to openly discuss it. The Wilson home stood like a shadowed fortress, its windows closed and the curtains drawn tight. Mark and Sarah had not been seen since the night the officers entered their house. Yet, the tension in the air was palpable, as if the entire neighborhood was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable. Mrs. Adams, however, couldn't shake the feeling that something still wasn't right. Despite Josh being in the care of the authorities, the mystery of what had truly happened in that house weighed heavily on her mind. The notebook had revealed only pieces of a larger, more sinister puzzle. She knew the police were investigating, but she couldn't sit idly by, not knowing the full truth. Her thoughts drifted back to the boy, Tim, who had been sneaking food to Josh. Perhaps he knew more than he had let on. That afternoon, Mrs. Adams decided to pay a visit to Tim's home. She knocked on the door, and after a few moments, a weary-looking woman answered. It was Tim's mother, a kind but cautious woman whom Mrs. Adams had spoken with a few times in passing. "I'm sorry to bother you," Mrs. Adams began, "but I need to speak with Tim. It's about Josh." Tim's mother hesitated but eventually nodded, calling for her son. Tim appeared moments later, his face pale but curious. Mrs. Adams knelt down to his level, trying to keep her voice calm and reassuring. "Tim, I know you've been helping Josh, and I'm so grateful that you did. But I need to know more. Did Josh ever tell you what he saw? What made his parents so angry?" Tim glanced nervously at his mother, who gave him a nod of encouragement. "He told me some things," Tim said quietly, his voice trembling. "He said his dad was involved in something bad. Real bad. Josh wasn't supposed to know, but he overheard them talking one night. That's when everything changed." Mrs. Adams' stomach twisted. "What was it, Tim? What did Josh overhear?" Tim shifted uncomfortably, his small hands fidgeting. "It was something about money. His dad. He owes people. Dangerous people. Josh told me he heard his dad say something about a deal that went wrong. And there was this man. Josh said he saw him come to the house late one night. After that, his dad got real mad at him, said he shouldn't have been awake, shouldn't have seen anything." The words sent a chill down Mrs. Adams' spine. It was worse than she had imagined. Mark Wilson wasn't just punishing Josh out of strictness. He was trying to protect his own secrets. Secrets that were tied to something far more dangerous than just family disputes. If Josh had overheard details about a botched deal involving dangerous people, then his safety was in jeopardy. "Thank you, Tim," Mrs. Adams said gently, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You've been a good friend to Josh. I promise you, we'll keep him safe." As Mrs. Adams made her way back home, her mind raced with the new information. She knew she had to tell the police what she had learned, but a new fear gnawed at her. If Mark Wilson was truly involved with dangerous people, then Josh's removal from the house might not be enough. Those who Mark owed wouldn't stop, just because the police had stepped in. Later that evening, Mrs. Adams called the detective assigned to Josh's case. She explained everything that Tim had told her, urging the detective to dig deeper into Mark Wilson's dealings. The detective listened intently, and while he didn't reveal much about the ongoing investigation, he promised Mrs. Adams that they were working to uncover the truth. As night fell, Mrs. Adams sat by her window, staring at the darkened Wilson home. The silence of the night felt suffocating, as though the house itself held the weight of its terrible secrets. She couldn't help but wonder what Josh was feeling now, wherever he was. Was he relieved to be away from the house? Or was the fear of what he had seen still haunting him? She knew the investigation would take time, but she also knew one thing for certain. The truth was coming to light. And when it did, the Wilson family would never be the same. The days that followed were a blur of tension and unease. The Wilson house remained dark and silent, but Mrs. Adams could feel the weight of the storm brewing. The police had been in and out of the house, questioning Mark and Sarah, searching for more evidence. But Mrs. Adams knew the real danger didn't lie within the walls of that house. It was outside, in the shadows, waiting to strike. She couldn't stop thinking about what Tim had told her. The mysterious man who had visited the Wilsons late at night, the whispers of a dangerous deal gone wrong. If this man was still out there, Josh's safety was far from guaranteed. The police might have taken him out of the house, but the threat still loomed large. One evening, as Mrs. Adams sat on her porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, she saw movement at the edge of the street. A tall figure stood in the shadows, barely visible in the fading light. Her heart skipped a beat as she squinted, trying to make out the figure's features, but he stayed just out of reach, his face obscured. He lingered there for a few moments before disappearing into the darkness, leaving Mrs. Adams with a growing sense of dread. The next morning, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. She decided to call the detective again, her voice filled with urgency as she relayed what she had seen. "There was someone outside the Wilson house last night," she said. "I couldn't see his face, but I know it's connected to what Josh overheard. I think this man is watching the house, maybe even waiting for something." The detective listened carefully, his tone serious. "We'll look into it, Mrs. Adams," he assured her. "We've been following leads on Mark Wilson's connections, and if there's someone involved in this, we'll find them. But please be careful. Don't confront anyone. Let us handle this." Despite the detective's reassurances, Mrs. Adams couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. She kept a close eye on the Wilson house, watching for any sign of movement. She knew that whoever this man was, he wasn't finished. And until the police uncovered the full extent of Mark's involvement, the danger would remain. Later that day, Mrs. Adams received a knock on her door. To her surprise, it was Sarah Wilson, standing on her porch with tear-streaked cheeks and a haunted look in her eyes. Mrs. Adams' heart raced as she opened the door, unsure of what to expect. "Sarah," she said softly, stepping aside to let her in. "What's going on?" Sarah's voice trembled as she spoke, her words rushed and broken. I don't know what to do anymore. Mark, he's involved in something terrible, and it's all falling apart. I never wanted any of this. I just wanted to protect Josh, but now—" Her voice broke, and she buried her face in her hands. Mrs. Adams led her to the kitchen, offering her a seat at the table. "Tell me everything, Sarah. I need to know what's happening so I can help." Through her sobs, Sarah explained how Mark had fallen into debt with dangerous people, men who had come to their house late at night, demanding payment. The deal that had gone wrong was more than just a business failure. It was a crime, one that Mark had tried to cover up. And Josh, innocent and curious, had overheard everything. Mark had panicked, terrified that Josh would accidentally expose them. And that's when he made the decision to force him outside, to isolate him, hoping that keeping Josh silent would protect them all. "He's coming back," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. "The man, the one who came to our house. He's coming back, and this time, I don't think we can stop him." Mrs. Adams felt a chill run down her spine. This was it, the moment she had feared. The man in the shadows was real, and he was closing in. She quickly stood, her voice firm. "Sarah, we need to go to the police right now. They need to know what's happening before it's too late." Sarah nodded weakly, wiping her eyes as she rose from the table. Together, they left the house, heading straight to the police station. Mrs. Adams knew that they were running out of time, but with Sarah's confession, she hoped that they could finally stop the danger before it reached Josh. As they walked through the quiet streets, Mrs. Adams couldn't help but glance over her shoulder, half expecting to see the man in the shadows lurking behind them. The sense of impending doom was undeniable, but for Josh's sake, they had to face it head-on. Mrs. Adams and Sarah arrived at the police station just as dusk began to settle over the town. The tension in the air was thick, and every shadow seemed to carry a threat. Inside the station, the atmosphere was equally heavy, with officers moving briskly, phones ringing, and files being shuffled. Detective Parker, the lead investigator on the case, met them at the front desk, his expression serious but calm. "You did the right thing coming here," Parker said as he led them to a private room. "We've been piecing together the situation with Mark Wilson, but your testimony is going to help us move forward." What you've told us about this man, he's our priority now. Sarah, still trembling, took a deep breath and began to tell the full story. She revealed everything: how Mark had become involved with a group of dangerous men, the failed deal, and how they had used their home to cover up illegal activities. Josh had overheard a conversation between Mark and one of the men late one night, and in his panic, Mark had forced his son to sleep outside, fearing that Josh would reveal what he had heard. "We've been living in fear ever since," Sarah confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. "That man, the one Josh saw, he's been threatening us. Mark kept saying that as long as Josh stayed quiet, we'd be safe. But I know it's not true. He's coming back, and this time, I think he means to hurt us." Detective Parker leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "Do you know when this man is supposed to come back?" Sarah shook her head. "No, but Mark told me he's been getting calls from a blocked number. I think it's only a matter of days." Parker nodded, his expression grim. "We'll put surveillance on the house immediately. We need to get ahead of this before it escalates further." He turned to Mrs. Adams. "Thank you for bringing this to our attention. Your vigilance may have saved Josh's life." As the two women sat in the police station, the gravity of the situation began to sink in. The man in the shadows wasn't just a fleeting presence. He was a real and immediate threat. And now that the police were involved, there was no turning back. Sarah had effectively put a target on herself by coming forward, and Mrs. Adams knew that they were now racing against time. That night, under police protection, Sarah returned to the Wilson house, while Mrs. Adams went back home. Despite the presence of officers nearby, she felt a growing sense of unease. The Wilsons had been living in fear for months, and the man who had terrorized them was still out there, watching, waiting. She tried to calm her nerves, telling herself that the police would catch him before anything happened. But deep down, she knew the danger was far from over. The next morning, the neighborhood was on edge. The sight of police cars parked discreetly near the Wilson house had drawn the attention of everyone on the street. Rumors swirled, and the once quiet suburban enclave was now filled with tension. Mrs. Adams kept her distance, watching from her window as officers moved in and out of the house, setting up surveillance and preparing for the worst. Then, late that night, it happened. Mrs. Adams was lying in bed when she heard it, a soft rustling outside her window, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. She sat up, her heart racing, and quickly moved to the window. In the dim light of the street lamp, she saw him. A tall, shadowy figure was moving toward the Wilson house, his movements slow and deliberate. It was the man in the shadows. Her breath caught in her throat as she watched him slip past the police patrol, careful to stay out of sight. He was heading straight for the back of the house, where Josh had once been forced to sleep. Mrs. Adams' heart pounded in her chest as she reached for her phone, quickly dialing 911. "He's here," she whispered urgently. "The man, he's at the Wilson house." The operator assured her that officers were being dispatched immediately, but Mrs. Adams knew they didn't have much time. She watched helplessly as the man disappeared behind the Wilson house, out of her view. The seconds felt like hours as she waited for the police to arrive, her mind racing with fear for Sarah and Josh. Just as the patrol cars pulled up, a sudden sharp sound shattered the stillness of the night. Mrs. Adams flinched, her heart pounding in her ears. The police rushed toward the house, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. She strained to see what was happening, but the thick shadows obscured her view. For a moment, all was silent. Then a scuffle broke out. Shouts echoed through the neighborhood as officers converged on the backyard. Mrs. Adams could see them now, wrestling the man to the ground, his dark figure struggling against the police. Relief flooded her as she watched the officers subdue him, but the fear still lingered. What had he intended to do? How far had he planned to go? As the man was led away in handcuffs, Mrs. Adams finally allowed herself to breathe. The danger had passed, for now, but the shadow of what had happened in the Wilson household still loomed large, and the full truth of Mark's involvement had yet to be revealed. The morning after the man was arrested, the neighborhood woke to an uneasy calm. The police presence had intensified around the Wilson home, and for the first time in weeks, there was a flicker of hope. The mysterious man who had terrorized Josh and his family was now behind bars, but Mrs. Adams knew the real story wasn't over. The roots of Mark Wilson's involvement ran much deeper than just this one figure, and the consequences of those actions were just beginning to surface. Detective Parker visited Mrs. Adams later that day, his expression more solemn than usual. "We've been interrogating the man we apprehended," he said, sitting at her kitchen table. "He's not just a hired thug. He's connected to a larger criminal organization that's been involved in money laundering and illegal activities in the city for years." Mrs. Adams' breath caught. She had known something was wrong, but this was far worse than she imagined. "Mark Wilson got in over his head," Parker continued. "He borrowed money from these people to cover up financial problems in his business, but when the deal went south, they came after him. Josh, unfortunately, saw something he shouldn't have. From what we've gathered, Mark's fear of his son exposing the truth wasn't just paranoia. These men made it clear that if anyone talked, there would be serious consequences." Mrs. Adams shook her head, still processing the information. "And what about Josh?" she asked. "Is he safe now?" Parker nodded, but his eyes were dark. "For now, yes. But it's going to be a long road for him. We've placed him in protective custody, and Child Services are working to ensure he gets the care he needs. As for Mark, we've arrested him. He's being charged with multiple offenses, including child endangerment and conspiracy with these criminals. Sarah is cooperating with us, but she'll likely face charges too." The weight of the situation pressed down on Mrs. Adams. The Wilson family, once a picture of suburban perfection, had been torn apart by greed, lies, and fear. And at the center of it all was Josh, a boy who had borne the brunt of his parents' mistakes. "Will Josh ever be able to come home?" she asked quietly. Parker sighed. "It's hard to say. He'll need time to heal, both physically and emotionally. We're doing everything we can to make sure he's placed with a family that will support him. But the trauma he's experienced, it's going to take a long time for him to recover." As the detective left, Mrs. Adams sat in her quiet kitchen, reflecting on everything that had happened. She had fought so hard to protect Josh, but now that the truth was out, the consequences felt even more devastating than the mystery. The Wilson family was broken, and the scars left on Josh might never fully heal. Yet, in her heart, Mrs. Adams knew she had done the right thing. She had saved him from a far worse fate, and that was something. A month passed since the night the man was arrested, and life in the neighborhood slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy. The Wilson house stood empty, a constant reminder of the chaos that had once consumed it. Every now and then, Mrs. Adams would catch a glimpse of a car parked outside, likely more investigators or representatives from the bank. But it was clear that the Wilsons were gone for good. Josh had been placed in foster care with a family in a nearby town. Mrs. Adams had received updates from the caseworker, assuring her that Josh was adjusting as well as could be expected. He was attending therapy regularly, and though he still struggled with the trauma of what had happened, he was slowly beginning to open up. The notebook, which had once been a symbol of his silence, was now being used in his recovery, a way for him to process the pain and fear he had been forced to carry. One sunny afternoon, Mrs. Adams received a letter in the mail. It was from Josh. She opened it carefully, her heart pounding as she read his small, shaky handwriting. "Dear Mrs. Adams, I just wanted to say thank you for everything you did for me. I was really scared for a long time, but you helped me when no one else did. I'm in a new home now, and things are better. I'm still learning to feel safe, but I'm getting there. I miss you and Tim and my old neighborhood sometimes, but I think it's better this way. Thank you for being brave when I couldn't be. Love, Josh." Tears filled Mrs. Adams' eyes as she folded the letter carefully and placed it on her table. The road ahead for Josh was still long, but knowing that he was safe, healing, and beginning to find some peace gave her a deep sense of relief. She had been his voice when he had none, and now he was learning to reclaim his own. The neighborhood was changing too. New families were moving in, and the memory of the Wilsons' secrets began to fade, replaced by the hum of children playing in the streets and the warmth of neighbors greeting each other. But Mrs. Adams knew she would never forget. She would always remember Josh, his courage, and the way the truth, no matter how dark, had finally come to light. As the sun set on that quiet afternoon, Mrs. Adams stood by her window, watching the world outside. Life was moving forward, and with it came hope Hope for Josh, hope for the neighborhood, and hope that, in the end, even the darkest secrets could be overcome. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more content like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. And now, you've got a new video appearing on the screen, full of unexpected twists and touching moments. Click and get ready for another inspiring story.